Hey guys, tonight we're wading into one of the things the medieval world did better than almost anything else: paranoia, and the strange fact that so much of it turned out to be justified. Before we begin, if this channel is the sort of thing you enjoy, a like and a subscribe genuinely help, but only do it if you mean it. And I'd love to know down in the comments where in the world you're listening from and what the clock says where you are. It never stops amazing me how far and wide this little community stretches. Now, on to the history. If you happened to be a medieval king, the single safest thing you could put in your mouth was nothing at all, because the royal kitchen wasn't really a kitchen. It was a hazard zone in which every pot, every pan, and every cheerfully smiling servant stood for a slightly different way you might be murdered. The cooks weren't merely preparing supper. They were, unintentionally, and now and then quite intentionally, running a daily campaign of biochemical warfare. Picture the scene. You stroll in as the most powerful man in the realm, and you're met at once by the comforting perfume of boiling meat, scorched bread, and that one fish that ought to have been laid to rest several months back. The head cook insists it's fresh, which in medieval terms means we brushed most of the flies off, and that's before the plotting even gets going. To guard against all this, kings kept tasters. A grand-sounding title, right up until you notice it really means, please swallow this mysterious stew and tell me whether it ends you. It may be the only profession where getting through lunch alive qualifies as a career advancement. These tasters would gamely try every dish. If they lived, the king dined. If they didn't, the king sent out for something else. And by something else I mean more soup, this time from the other cook, the one who looks a touch less homicidal. But here's the thing. Medieval rulers weren't being theatrical. Poisoning was very nearly a beloved hobby. Why go to the bother of toppling a throne with an actual war, all that marching and spending and sweating, when you could simply stir something questionable into the royal porridge? Consider King John of England. The chroniclers are quite sure he had at least one rival poisoned, which frankly tracks. This was a man petty enough to lose the crown jewels in a swamp, so quietly finishing off a relative was probably just an ordinary Wednesday. The Byzantine Empire, for its part, elevated death by dinner into a full competitive sport. Courtiers traded poisons the way children today trade collectible cards. A few emperors barely governed at all. They simply waited for the next meal, clutched their bellies with real flair, and let the next cousin in line take the reins. Even the papal kitchens offered no shelter. More than one cardinal had the good manners to drop dead right before an election, and the chroniclers filed it under the will of God, which is medieval for kindly do not inquire about what's bobbing in the wine. So yes, kings were paranoid. Honestly though, not paranoid enough. Every royal meal was a conspiracy theory waiting to be confirmed. Every bowl was a threat. Every spoonful a cliffhanger. In medieval Europe, staying alive had little to do with bravery or brawn or heavenly favour. It came down to whether you had a taster who was genuinely fond of you. Medieval Europe carried two great terrors. The first was anything that stirred in the woods after nightfall. The second was anything that stirred in the woods after nightfall while singing. And that second one leads us straight into the age's very finest conspiracy theory. Secret pagan cults tucked away in the forests, working forbidden rituals beneath the moon, most likely barefoot and quite definitely unwashed. The villagers swore these groups were real. The church swore they were real. The local cats probably swore it too. And here's the awkward part for the Middle Ages. The conspiracy happened to be completely true. But before you conjure up robed sorcerers calling down demons, reach instead for something a good deal more historically accurate. A handful of worn-out peasants slipping into the trees to sing old songs, burn a few herbs, and pray with everything they had that the crops would stop failing. Medieval life was grinding. You spend half the year hungry, and the other half trying not to be killed by the weather. If lighting a candle in the woods and murmuring to the old spirits brought a little comfort, people were going to do exactly that. And they did. These gatherings weren't sinister. They were closer to illegal support groups with slightly nicer incense. The church, however, saw it another way entirely. Anything not stamped and approved by Rome was, by default, a satanic scheme. And so, enter the forest cult hunters. Priests who tramped into the woods equipped with torches, holy water, and absolutely no wilderness skills whatsoever. Usually they tripped over a tree root, shrieked at an owl, and went home boasting they'd frightened off a demon. But every so often they truly did trip over something. Stone circles the locals still used, bundles of scorched herbs arranged in odd patterns, symbols carved deeper into time than Christianity itself. Half a dozen peasants who very much did not care to discuss their weekend activities. The most celebrated of these hidden circles were the Benandanti of northern Italy. People who claimed, quite literally, that they left their bodies at night to do battle with witches and defend their harvests, and the wild part is that they believed every word of it. The church hauled them in expecting confessions of devilry, and instead received what amounted to medieval superhero roleplay. Then there were the forest healers, women and a scattering of men who leaned on herbs, salves, moonlit rituals, and perhaps a bit of soft chanting to treat the sick. Herbalism was perfectly legal, right up until you got good at it. Then, all at once, it became devil's work. So yes, the whispers were accurate. Medieval Europe really did shelter secret pagan cults among the trees. Not wicked, not monstrous, just deeply committed to not letting the church spoil their evening. If you grew up imagining medieval monks as gentle souls quietly copying manuscripts and baking loaves, I'm sorry to be the one to tell you that some of them were essentially the CIA in robes. While the villagers prayed, the nobles schemed, and the kings fretted over their soup, the monasteries were busy with a rather different sort of holy calling. Gathering information. And yes, that's medieval for spying. The church, being the single largest institution on the continent, needed eyes in every corner. And who better than monks? They were literate, quiet, and already conditioned to observe human sin with the focused intensity of a judgmental cat. They moved between monasteries, collected gossip dressed up as confession, and set it all down in tidy manuscripts. You could call them historians. The more honest word is intelligence, analysts with superior penmanship. The Dominicans were the worst offenders, or the best, depending on how fond you are of organized paranoia. Their entire order was built around rooting out heresy, which meant questioning villagers, intercepting letters, and watching people just a bit too intently. Sneeze near the wrong scripture, and a Dominican friar would somehow materialize, ready with follow-up questions. Plenty of kings quietly paid monks to report on court scandals, troop movements, and whether the local nobles were arranging a suspicious feast. It was the medieval version of a subscription service. Things grew more interesting still with the rise of the Inquisition. Suddenly the church possessed a whole institution devoted to collecting incriminating detail. Monks interviewed heretics, questioned locals, and wrote down the juiciest rumors to send up the chain. Some reports were deadly serious. Political uprisings, forbidden pagan rites, buried rebellions. Others read more like gossip columns. Brother Gregory reports the shoemaker's wife was seen after dark carrying suspicious herbs, possibly a witch, further surveillance advised. Not every monk was in the spying business, of course, but enough of them were that people started to notice. Villagers muttered that the monasteries knew everything, and they weren't wrong. A monk could stroll into town, buy a loaf, ask 3 courteous questions, and walk away knowing more about your marriage than your spouse did. So yes, the conspiracy was real. Behind the chanting and the candlelight, the monasteries ran a quiet, continent-spanning web of secrets, information, and surveillance. And unlike most medieval institutions, it actually functioned. If you'd asked a medieval European what the Knights Templar were up to, they'd have leaned in and whispered something like, "Oh, you know, guarding treasure, hoarding secrets, worshipping a mysterious head, steering kings, menacing the Pope, inventing banking, summoning demons, the usual evening." As it turns out, the deadliest weapon in the Middle Ages wasn't the sword or the crossbow or even the poisoned stew. It was a monk with an excellent memory. Routine. Medieval people adored a lurid conspiracy, and the Templars were their very favourite subject. The best part is that a fair bit of it was actually true. The Templars started out as a modest band of knights sworn to protect pilgrims, noble, holy, admirable. Then they suffered a dreadful curse. They became successful. Within a century they were so powerful that kings had to pencil their paranoia in around them. The Templars held castles, land, whole fleets of ships, and more money than half of Europe combined. They were essentially a medieval blend of the Navy SEALs, the Federal Reserve, and the one cult your aunt keeps researching online. And great power, as ever, draws great suspicion. Rumour insisted the Templars sat atop an immense hoard of treasure. Unluckily for Europe, that part was true. They built the first Europe-wide banking system. A pilgrim could deposit money in England and withdraw it in Jerusalem, which feels suspiciously modern for people who still feared mirrors. The Templars kept coded ledgers, ran secure vaults, and shifted money with an efficiency that unnerved kings and deeply irritated tax collectors. Then came the secret rituals. The Templars met behind closed doors, held ceremonies by night, and swore oaths no outsider was permitted to see. Naturally, Europe concluded they must be worshipping a mysterious severed head called Baphomet, which is medieval, for we have no idea what they're doing, so let's assume the very worst. The truth was duller. Their rituals were private because they involved confessions, discipline, and organizational rules. Tedious. But the medieval mind simply could not abide tedious. It wanted drama, and drama it received. King Philip IV of France, permanently broke and remarkably gifted at pinning the blame on others, decided the Templars were heretics, which is medieval, for I want your things. He had them arrested, tortured, and pressed into confessions so outlandish they make modern conspiracy theories look bashful. Except here's the twist. Philip wasn't entirely off the mark. The Templars did possess a treasure, did operate a secretive empire of money, and did keep knowledge from the public. Not demonic knowledge, just banking procedures and military codes. But to medieval Europe that was more or less the same thing. So yes, the Templars were the victims of lies, and also thoroughly guilty of being far too powerful for their own good. Their secrecy wasn't dark sorcery, it was sound bookkeeping, which in medieval Europe was practically witchcraft. Anyway, when the Black Death swept into Europe in 1347, people quite reasonably went looking for answers. What caused it? How did it move so fast? Why did it seem so partial to crowded cities and men who never washed their hands? Most villagers pointed at demons, foul air, or the neighbour's strangely shifty goat. But one especially juicy theory surfaced. The church knew more about the plague than it was letting on. And unsettlingly, this time, the conspiracy wasn't entirely wrong. The papacy and the senior clergy had access to medical reports, merchant letters, and incoming ship logs that ordinary people never laid eyes on. They knew when outbreaks were creeping through the port cities. They knew when trade routes were caving in. They knew when whole monasteries were dropping like flies. And while the peasants were still out in the fields wondering why their neighbour had abruptly erupted in boils, the bishops were quietly packing their bags and slipping off to countryside villas with much better airflow. To be fair, the medieval clergy weren't physicians. Half of them believed sickness came from corrupted humours, and the other half figured it came from God being mildly annoyed. But they did hold one undeniable edge: information. And in the Middle Ages, information travelled slower than a peasant on a Monday morning. There are records of bishops sealing city gates ahead of the plague waves without offering any explanation. Monasteries bolted themselves shut from the inside. Clergy warned one another in coded letters with lines like "The ship brings dark tidings," which is medieval for "Do not go outside, everything is on fire." More suspicious still were the quarantine orders. Some were issued before the plague had visibly arrived, meaning someone, somewhere, knew something. The merchants noticed it too. Venetian traders wrote of odd warnings from church officials, told to steer clear of certain ports a week before the plague broke out there. That's not divine prophecy. That's insider trading with a few extra steps. Meanwhile, the guidance handed to the public was rather less useful. People were instructed to repent, pray harder, burn fragrant herbs, or avoid excessive joy. Yes, really. Joy was rated a plague risk. Medieval Europe was truly devoted to suffering. So, did the church deliberately conceal things? Probably not out of malice, but they absolutely put themselves first and held back timely warnings because they didn't want to spark panic, forfeit their authority, or admit they had no earthly idea how to stop it. In the end, the peasants had it right. Someone did know more, they simply weren't sharing. If you're still picturing medieval monks as peaceful men humming hymns and tending their herb gardens, it's time to gently set that image alight. Because, tucked in among the holy texts and the chanting were certain specialists. Discreet gentlemen, problem solvers, men who could recite the Psalms from memory and also remove a political rival without once disturbing the choir practice. Yes, medieval Europe really did keep assassins in its monasteries. And no, this isn't the premise of some dubious streaming series. It happened. The thing is, these men weren't monks out of any love for God. They were monks for the practical benefits. Taking vows meant a roof, regular meals, protection under church law, and the freedom to cross from one kingdom into the next, without a single guard asking why your bag was so unusually heavy. A monk's robe was, in effect, the era's all-access pass. And who was paying for these devout killers? Nobles, naturally. The same crowd already busy slipping poison into one another's soup. When a lord wanted a task handled quietly, cleanly, and with room to deny everything afterward, he didn't dispatch a knight. Knights were loud. Knights boasted. Knights had a talent for tripping over their own armour. Instead, he sent for a certain brother, the kind of man nobody thought to interrogate. Often these were lay brothers, the members of a monastery who did the physical work rather than bending over manuscripts all day. They had powerful arms, very few witnesses, and a flawless reason to be on the road. "I'm gathering arms," they would say. Perfectly innocent aside from the dagger resting under the robe. The chronicles never come out and confirm such men walked among them, yet they scatter hints. Rather a lot of hints. A nobleman dies for no clear reason. A political rival happens to topple out of a window. A stubborn landholder abruptly finds religion, signs everything over to the church, and is never seen again. Letters survive in which monks grumble about brothers who neglect their spiritual discipline, which is really just cloister. Speak for someone keeps slipping out after dark, and we've no idea where he goes. There are even documented instances of monks discovered with concealed weapons, disguises, or heretical letters. None of them ever confessed, of course. Monks kept marvellous straight faces, and they enjoyed the extra shield of hinting that any accusation was really an insult aimed at God himself. And the kingdoms let it slide. Why? Because monasteries got problems solved with speed, discretion, and almost no mess left behind. So yes, when medieval villagers muttered that certain monks were deadlier than their sermons let on, they had it exactly right. Behind the candlelight and the psalms, a few monasteries sheltered men who could pray over your soul and then arrange for you to meet your maker in person. When most people picture witch hunts, their minds jump to the 15 and 1600s. Bonfires, tall pointed hats, furious men shouting that the devil was lurking inside the family goat. But the reality is that quiet witch hunts were already underway, long before the practice became fashionable. Medieval Europe didn't hold off panicking until the Renaissance arrived. The fear was there early, and on a few counts the fear wasn't even misplaced. Before the official craze took hold, villagers traded hushed talk of wise women out gathering herbs by night. These weren't broom-riding sorceresses. They were the local healers, the midwives, the unofficial counselors. The ones you turned to when a real physician was beyond your means, which was essentially always, since medieval doctors mostly prescribed bleeding you until you expired. These women understood plants, remedies, poisons, childbirth, and how to make a husband's headache go away, occasionally on a permanent basis. Knowledge like that was tremendously valuable, and that alone was enough to put the church on edge, because in medieval Europe simply knowing things was very nearly an offence. So the villages spun up a little conspiracy theory of their own. These women, they decided, belonged to a hidden network passing forbidden law beneath the moon. The herbs were coded signals. The knotted cords were charms of protection. The gatherings at midnight were planning sessions. And dramatic as it all sounds, it wasn't entirely off the mark. There genuinely were circles of healers who taught one another, handed down their learning, and shared risky remedies in secret so the church wouldn't brand them witches. But slips happened. Some of these women cured ailments the church couldn't. Some read the coming weather better than any priest. Some patched up failing marriages with love potions that surely broke a commandment, or three, which obviously meant they had to be in a partnership with Satan. Livestock dies, blame the healer. Harvest fails, blame the healer. Your husband runs off to join the crusade because you kept badgering him about emptying the chamber pot. Well, clearly the healer put a spell on him. And yet, underneath all the hysteria, the theory carried one thin thread of truth. Secret meetings of skilled practitioners really did take place. Their only magic, though, was science, herbs, and hard-won experience. In a world governed by superstition, plain competence could pass for the supernatural. So villagers were hunting witches well before any manual on the subject existed. They hauled them before local courts, grilled them in barns, and now and then tried drowning them in rivers. These early hunts were messy, disorganized, and deeply amateurish, yet no less real for it. The bitter irony is that the only witches who truly existed were the ones working to keep everyone alive, which in the Middle Ages counted as thoroughly suspicious behavior. Medieval kings were nothing if not theatrical. They adored the grand gesture, the stirring speech, the pointless war, and every so often faking their own death, or at the very least convincing everyone that they had. And here's the striking part. Ordinary people suspected as much. They murmured about it over ale in the taverns. They handed the rumours down through the generations. And in at least one gloriously tangled case, their conspiracy theory turned out not to be entirely wrong. Consider the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick, a man so odd, so clever, and so unsettlingly ahead of his age that Europe simply didn't know how to handle him. He spoke several languages, delighted in science, composed poetry, and kept his own private menagerie, all of which instantly made him a figure of suspicion to peasants convinced that any man fond of books was probably keeping company with demons. Frederick II died in 1250, and it was a grand, public, well-witnessed affair. The Church exhaled with relief. Europe laid him to rest. Everyone moved along. Except they didn't. Because almost at once the whispers began that Frederick hadn't actually died. He was only in hiding, catching his breath, biding his time, getting ready to come back and take up his empire again like some medieval Batman, but with shabbier armour and a superior interest in falconry. Whole cults formed around the notion. People claimed to have glimpsed him roaming the woods in disguise. Merchants swore they dealt with a mysterious nobleman who paid with Frederick's old coins. A fisherman insisted the emperor had stopped to ask him for directions. Peasants vowed that a hooded man at mass in Sicily stood exactly the way Frederick used to, which is a remarkably precise detail to fixate on unless you're a bit obsessed. You might dismiss all this as standard medieval fantasy, but then matters got knottier. Into the confusion stepped Richard of Eastwell, a man who, generations later, claimed to be the secret son of Richard III. Another suspiciously well-educated, suspiciously polished stranger who wouldn't explain where he came from. He spoke Latin. He knew the manners of a royal court. He carried himself like someone who had never once washed his own clothes. Historians still quarrel over him. In both stories, something is plainly not adding up. Medieval rulers did occasionally stage dramatic goodbyes, disappear for months at a stretch, or swap identities for their own political safety. And since record-keeping in those days amounted to Bob jotting it down before knocking his wine across the page, who could ever really confirm a thing? So yes, the conspiracy theory rested on wobbly but tempting legs. Sometimes kings didn't die at all. They quietly retired and left everyone else to sort out the wreckage. And honestly, who could hold it against them? In a world of plagues, revolts, crusades, and poisoned soup, you'd probably fake your death too. Few things frightened medieval Europeans more than water. Not demons, not plague, not taxes. Water. because water couldn't be predicted. It might feed your fields, drown your children, or hand you dysentery before you'd finish breakfast. So when people started dying without explanation, villagers did what villagers always did. They blamed the nearest well. The poisoned well theory caught on like a grass fire. A family falls ill, it's the well. Livestock drop dead, the well. The bread comes out burnt, or your cousin trips over a hen, plainly the well is cursed. The Middle Ages held a very loose grip on cause and effect. But beneath all the shouting and dread lay a darker fact. Now and then wells genuinely were poisoned, not by witches, demons, or ominously shaped clouds, but by rival towns, invading armies, and the occasional thoroughly enraged neighbour. During a siege, fouling the wells was more or less routine. Armies would toss in dead animals, poisonous plants, or whatever was foul enough to do the job, straight into the enemy's water. Nothing encourages a surrender quite like a decomposing goat bobbing in your bucket. Siege manuals actually advised it. Picture a military handbook that calmly lists Step 3, sabotage their plumbing. Ordinary villagers, of course, knew nothing of siege doctrine. So when people began dropping dead miles from any battlefield, they cooked up their own reasons. Outsiders were the crowd favourites. A traveller passing through, poisoner. A merchant peddling herbs, definitely a poisoner. Anyone who looked capable of reading, don't even get started. One of the grimmest chapters came during the Black Death, when towns accused Jewish communities of poisoning the wells. It wasn't true. But the tragedy shows just how deeply the theory had burrowed into medieval minds. Water was dangerous, mysterious, and perfectly suited to accusation. And yet, even in calm times, wells could turn foul on their own. Rain flushed filth into them. Dead rats tumbled in. Rotting leaves fermented into a medieval smoothie of death. Most wells were really just unfiltered holes in the earth, ringed by people who bathed maybe once a year and assumed germs were somehow tied to astrology. So, were wells poisoned? Technically, yes, though mostly by bacteria, which medieval folk would have filed squarely under witchcraft. The irony stings. Villagers terrified one another with tales of hidden poisoners while nature handled most of the poisoning free of charge. But when the whole world feels like it's tilting, you reach for the simple answer. And in the Middle Ages, the simplest answer to nearly anything was the well did it. Medieval Europe was positively fond of an identity crisis. If a stranger drifted into town announcing he was a long-lost prince, nobody paused to doubt it. They threw a feast on the spot, launched into arguments about bloodlines, and sharpened a few pitchforks just to be safe. And it wasn't merely that medieval people were gullible. They were, but that's beside the point. It was that royal impostors really did crop up all the time. In an age without photographs, fingerprints, dental records, or even a fixed way to spell a name, identifying anybody came down to a shared guess. Does he look royal? Was the era's version of a background check, and looking royal generally meant keeping all your teeth and not reeking of onions. Which brings us to one of the strangest cases, Richard of Eastwell. According to the local accounts, he turned up in Kent in the 1400s, claiming, softly, politely, and with great mystery, to be the secret son of Richard III. A bold assertion. But then he showed off talents no common peasant should possess. Reading Latin, writing with a lovely hand, holding his cutlery correctly, and not so much as wincing when someone brought up taxes, deeply suspicious conduct. He never flatly admitted it, only dropped heavy hints, and since medieval England loved a good drama, people believed him. Centuries on, historians still debate where he came from, because the particulars line up just a touch too neatly. Medieval record-keeping might as well have been scrawled on napkins, so the door stays deliciously open. But Richard wasn't the only one. Medieval Europe fairly teemed with resurrected royals. A well-known instance concerns Anastasia of Poland, who died young, only for several women to surface afterward, claiming to be her, each equipped with court knowledge and eerily familiar habits. Entire regions marched to war over whether some person was or wasn't a princess, because nothing signals healthy government like a field full of armed men bellowing, "That's definitely her," while having no idea what she actually looked like. And then came the cases where the imposter was no imposter at all. In a crisis, some rulers fled, went to ground, or tried dodging assassination by dressing as commoners. A king or prince in plain clothes wasn't a conspiracy theory, it was a survival tactic, which meant every tale of a mysterious stranger carried a faint layer of truth beneath it. The real trouble was that medieval politics adored a plot twist. Whenever a royal died under suspicious circumstances, which was always, people leapt straight to the bodies of fake, the death was staged, the rulers living in secret somewhere, probably regretting every decision that led to a crown. So yes, royal impostors were a medieval conspiracy. And that conspiracy came true so often that Europe eventually stopped wondering, is this possible? And started asking, all right, which cousin is playing dead this time? If you've ever pictured what the medieval equivalent of the restricted section might look like, imagine a small, dust-choked room tucked inside a monastery, sealed behind 3 bolts and guarded by a monk who looks as though he hasn't slept since the Third Crusade. Inside sit shelves of books the church wanted no one to open, the sort villagers whispered about as if they were cursed relics. And here's the twist. These forbidden book vaults were entirely real. The church held sway over most learning in medieval Europe. If you wished to read, to write, or to do anything more mentally taxing than counting sheep, you went through them, which naturally meant they also decided what you were forbidden to read. Anything that menaced their authority, clashed with scripture, or dared to suggest something scandalous, like the earth being in motion, was quietly pulled from circulation. But they didn't set fire to it all. Burning is messy, smoky, and draws crowds of peasants who will absolutely start asking questions nobody wants to field. Instead, they tucked the banned texts away in special archives known as armaria, scriptorium vaults, or in certain cases simply the locked room. Nobody enters except Brother Thomas, who looks guilty every single time he steps back out. And what waited inside? A surprisingly eclectic assortment. There were heretical gospels full of opinions that could earn you an interrogation faster than you could pronounce the word Inquisition. There were works of Arabic science that were plainly correct, yet awkwardly a few centuries ahead of Christian doctrine. There were medical treatises that described anatomy in enough detail to make a bishop go pale. There were even old pagan manuscripts that monks had copied out for research, which was the medieval way of saying I was curious and would rather not be punished for it. And the finest detail of all is that church officials genuinely argued over these vaults. Some insisted the knowledge had to be kept safe for the generations to come. Others insisted it had to be sealed away for good, precisely because it raised too many uncomfortable questions. Questions along the lines of, if this pagan text can correctly predict an eclipse, what else has it got right? A pause, some awkward shuffling, a bishop coughing loudly to steer the conversation elsewhere. These vaults were not merely a rumour. They were official practice. When inquisitors seized the libraries of accused heretics, they rarely burned it all. They catalogued it, examined it, and tucked it away. Knowledge, even the forbidden kind, was power. The conspiracy took hold because people could feel exactly what was going on. Somewhere behind those monastery walls sat books capable of changing minds, unsettling authority, or exposing truths that medieval Europe simply wasn't prepared to hear. And the villagers sensed it too. Behind the incense, behind the chanting, behind the bolted oak doors, the church guarded a carefully chosen hoard of knowledge. And, as with all treasure in the Middle Ages, the surest way to protect it was to insist it wasn't there at all. If there was a single corner of medieval Europe where conspiracy stopped being a theory and became a daily habit, it was Italy. Venice, Florence, Milan, Genoa, Siena, all lovely destinations now. Back then, though, they were essentially big-budget gangster films with far better architecture. These city-states spent centuries posing as peaceful trading hubs while quietly running a non-stop war of espionage, bribery, and back-alley diplomacy. For years, Italians murmured about a hidden struggle underneath the official alliances and treaties, a secret war of spies, saboteurs, coded letters, and accidents that only ever befell politically inconvenient people. The whole thing sounded dramatic, practically staged. Unfortunately, every word of it was accurate. The truth is that the Italian city-states were fiercely jealous of one another. If Florence made money, Siena had a crisis. If Venice signed a trade deal, Genoa threw a fit. If Milan raised a tower a touch higher than its neighbours, a feud broke out that outlasted 3 generations. They competed in everything: commerce, banking, architecture, fashion, and assassinations. Yes, assassinations counted as a cultural accomplishment. Out of all that chaos rose one of the most refined spy operations in medieval Europe. Venice, above all, was the stuff of legend. The Venetian government ran an entire secret intelligence council, complete with coded dispatches, financial surveillance, intercepted diplomacy, and a web of agents scattered across the continent like paranoid confetti. Their enemies feared them. Their allies feared them. Even the Venetians feared them. Venice also had its notorious Bocca di Leone, public drop boxes where any citizen could anonymously report a conspiracy, a crime, or simply that a neighbour was behaving suspiciously. A secret council read these notes and decided what deserved to be investigated, discouraged, or quietly made to disappear. Italy didn't invent the deep state, it just dressed it better. Florence, meanwhile, had a spy network of its own, run by the Medici family, who were so rich they could probably have purchased the very idea of honesty and then said, maybe some other time. Florence specialized in bribery and bending the banks. Milan specialized in intimidation. Genoa specialized in naval sabotage. Siena specialized in appearing to mind its own business while absolutely not minding its own business. The result was a steady, silent war. No armies on the march, no banners raised, just merchants vanishing, letters rewritten, alliances broken overnight, and treaties lost, so conveniently, in fires. So the conspiracy theorists had it right. Italy wasn't merely fighting wars. It was fighting all of them at once, quietly, courteously, and always in impeccable style. Long before a certain novel convinced half the internet that Jesus had a secret family living comfortably in France, medieval Europe was already fixated on holy bloodlines, hidden heirs, and scandalous family trees. The theory was straightforward. Noble houses were secretly descended from sacred or royal ancestors and were concealing the proof. Villagers whispered it. Nobles denied it. Chroniclers wrote it down with the enthusiasm of men who preferred gossip to journalism. And the best part is that some of it was genuinely true. In the Middle Ages, legitimacy was everything. You couldn't govern a village, let alone a kingdom, without waving your family tree around like a holy relic. But those family trees were messy things. Affairs happened. Wars happened. Now and then a mysterious infant turned up during a pilgrimage, and everyone politely declined to notice. It was all very courteous and deeply suspect. So the nobles found a fix: bury the embarrassing branches and inflate the flattering ones. All at once, half the noble families of Europe claimed descent from Charlemagne, a man who, if all these lineages were true, must have fathered something like 4,000 children. Others reached for Trojan ancestors, Roman emperors, or King David. Medieval genealogists weren't historians. They were imaginative writers armed with quills. Yet under all the invention, real hidden bloodlines did exist. Letters unearthed centuries later revealed illegitimate royal children quietly placed in monasteries, foster homes, or far-off country estates, along with the vague instruction to raise the boy and ask nothing. Some surfaced later, some never did. Some left descendants who learned, 500 years on, that great-great-grandmother had not been a peasant after all, but the secret daughter of a duke with poor self-control. One of the richest examples involves the Capetian dynasty of France, which quietly bankrolled certain noble houses for generations, houses suspiciously linked to lost royal infants. English chroniclers, meanwhile, recorded hidden heirs living under false names during civil wars, biding their time to reclaim the throne, which in practice usually meant never. And then there was the church. Monks occasionally scribbled irritated little notes such as, "Another noble child has been placed in our care, origin unknown," which was medieval shorthand for, "Someone left a baby again and won't tell us whose it is." So was there a conspiracy around holy bloodlines? Yes, though not because they were sacred. It already had enough royal drama to carry it right up to the apocalypse. When medieval Christians muttered about secret Jewish and Muslim networks working beneath the surface of Europe, they pictured something theatrical. Shadowy plotters passing coded notes, staging rebellions, coordinating across kingdoms like a medieval secret order. Naturally, the church panicked, the kings panicked, the villagers panicked, and the goats panicked, because goats always panic. But here is the twist almost no one was ready for. The networks were real, just not for the sinister reasons everyone imagined. They weren't scheming for world domination. They were scheming for survival. Throughout the Middle Ages, Jewish and Muslim communities were routinely persecuted, overtaxed, expelled, or, on especially tense days, accused of poisoning wells, summoning demons, or gazing a little too suspiciously at bread. So, to keep from being wiped out, these communities built underground systems for communication and escape, quiet, subtle, and aimed at overthrowing nothing except their own misfortune. The networks ran on safe houses, coded routes, sympathetic merchants, and doctors who travelled in disguise. Whole families slipped across borders using arranged signals, a lamp set in a window, a scratch beside a doorway, or a phrase such as, "Is the pomegranate harvest good this year?" which was medieval code for, "I am in danger and would very much like to leave now." Jewish communities kept informal transit routes running from France through the Rhineland to Iberia, each stop watched over by someone who had perfected the art of pretending nothing unusual was happening. Muslim communities in Spain and North Africa maintained cross-Mediterranean escape paths, moving fugitives, scholars, and hunted families with striking efficiency. Set beside most medieval institutions, which tended to operate like a donkey limping through molasses, these networks were remarkably competent. Of course, Christians read that competence as evidence of conspiracy. If a persecuted group managed to survive, they reasoned, it must be plotting something. The logic was peak medieval. They escaped danger, therefore suspicious, therefore increased the danger. And yet, behind all the hysteria, these underground systems saved countless lives. They preserved knowledge, sheltered families, and kept cultural traditions alive across centuries of hostility. Some historians even suggest they laid early groundwork for the more organized resistance movements of the Renaissance. Ironically, the only medieval conspiracy theorists who got this one right were the ones who wished harm. They sensed an invisible network, and there was one. They simply mistook its entire purpose. It wasn't a threat. It was a lifeline. So yes, the conspiracy was real. But rather than plotting Europe's downfall, these networks were doing something wildly out of character for the Middle Ages. They were helping people. Officially, medieval Europe ran on feudalism. Kings, nobles, peasants, duties, tithes, and taxes that made no sense to anyone, including the people collecting them. That was the system everyone discussed, the one written into the charters, the one priests preached about while conveniently ignoring their own accounts. But beneath that gloriously dysfunctional surface ran a second system, a quiet, unofficial, unregulated tangle of deals, favours, illegal markets, and under-the-table arrangements. Today, we'd call it the shadow economy. In medieval terms, it was just how things work, my son. And here's the amusing part. Everyone insisted it didn't exist while taking part in it daily. The theory went like this. Bands of thieves, smugglers, moneylenders, and enterprisingly flexible peasants operated outside the law, forming networks that reached across towns and even kingdoms. Secret trade routes, black market goods, illegal loans, and quiet bribes, humming along in every alley and tavern from London to Venice. Medieval people believed in this underground economy. They told stories about it. They warned their children about it. They drew dramatic lines about how sinful it all was, and they were entirely correct. Begin with the thieves' guilds. Yes, they existed. No, they didn't wear uniforms. But they carved out territories, settled disputes, and punished freelance thieves for breaching professional courtesy. Medieval law enforcement was so useless that thieves built their own HR department. Then there were the unofficial moneylenders, usually working out of the back rooms of taverns, monasteries, or that one house on the corner everyone avoided, since charging interest was technically a sin, unless you did it quietly, in which case it counted as mutual aid. Smuggling was everywhere. Salt, wine, grain, wool, ink, iron. If it could be taxed, someone was smuggling it. The king's tariff was less a law than a polite suggestion nobody honoured. Whole villages would mysteriously misplace their shipments just before the tax collectors arrived, only for those same goods to reappear moments later in the barn of a fellow named Pietro, who had found them lying in the road. The markets ran their own schemes too. Sellers fixed prices. Bakers padded bread with cheap flour. Butchers nudged the scales. Fishmongers swore their fish was fresh when it had clearly perished during the First Crusade. Everyone lied a little, stole a little, and nodded piously at Sunday Mass, as though God hadn't watched them cheat 3 customers that very morning. So the medieval shadow economy was real. It was thriving, and it was the only part of the economy that worked with any consistency. The greatest conspiracy wasn't that it existed, it was that everyone pretended to have no part in it. Night settled over Kaifeng softly, like silk sliding across the city. But the pleasure quarters never truly slept. As the sun sank behind the palace roofs and the merchants latched their shutters, another world stirred awake, one built not on laws or duty, but on sensation, artistry, and the delicate promise of escape. The lanterns were lit first, flickering gently as servants carried them out in long chains, each flame shielded behind lacquered shades of red, gold, and soft jade. Before long, the whole district glowed like a small constellation lowered to earth, shimmering above cobblestones worn smooth by generations of wandering feet. Passing through the first archway, a visitor felt the world change. The clamour of the daytime markets fell away behind them, replaced by the soft stroke of zithers, the steady tap of wooden blocks, and laughter drifting through silk curtains. Tea houses opened their doors with quiet pride, each promising a slightly different mood, some calm and scholarly, others lively and crowded with actors running their lines before the evening's performance. The air carried roasted barley tea, honeyed pastries, sandalwood incense, and now and then a faint breath of plum wine. What set Kaifeng's floating world apart was not only its beauty but its illusion, the feeling that once you stepped inside, time loosened its hold. Scholars who had spent the day buried in scrolls arrived to recite fresh poetry. Government clerks, worn thin by paperwork, came in search of a few hours of grace. Even wandering monks were known to pause at the district's edge and watch in silence, as if gazing into another realm entirely. The streets wound on like painted ribbons, every turn opening onto some new spectacle. A puppeteer ringed by children, a masked performer rehearsing his acrobatic leaps, courtesans behind gauzy screens arranging their hairpins, their calligraphy sets, their embroidered robes. Everything was motion, music, and expectation, and yet all of it stayed folded inside a serene, dreamlike order. Visitors often said that crossing into Kaifeng's pleasure quarters was like walking into a painting, a place where nothing coarse or hurried was allowed to reach you. The laughter came soft, the music rounded and low, the lantern light warm enough to lend even a passing stranger's face a certain poetry. It was a world at once real and unreal, shaped on purpose to ease the mind, tease the curiosity, and make each guest feel, for the length of a single evening, almost weightless. Here pleasure was never loud or crude. It was polished, patiently composed, and dressed in artistry. And this was only where it began. If the entrance to Kaifeng's floating world was a gentle breath, then its tea houses were its heartbeat, steady and warm and forever inviting. They lined the district like burnished gems, each with a character of its own, yet all bound by the same devotion to refinement. A few were plain, hung with bamboo blinds and set with simple clay pots. Others glowed with lacquered pillars, jade-green tiles, and carved screens showing cranes, plum blossoms, or scenes lifted from a beloved opera. Together they formed a slender corridor of light and fragrance that drew newcomers further into the quarter. To step inside a tea house was to step into an atmosphere spun carefully from ritual and intimacy. The first thing to greet you was always the scent, toasted barley, chrysanthemum petals, osmanthus blossoms, or the deeper, earthier warmth of aged puer bricks mellowed by time. Servers crossed the room with practiced grace, gliding between silk cushions and low wooden tables, carrying trays of steaming cups laid out like small constellations. Conversation stayed hushed, as if even laughter respected the delicate balance of flavor and sound. These were more than places to drink. They were listening rooms, social theatres, sanctuaries for a wandering mind. Scholars met here to argue poetry and philosophy, testing one another with verses scratched hastily onto fresh scrolls. Would-be officials weighed their chances at the examinations, feigning calm while their nerves ran underneath. Merchants struck bargains beneath layers of careful courtesy, and soldiers passing through the capital sat in silence, tasting a few quiet hours before harsher duties called them back. Yet the deepest charm of these rooms came from the courtesans who performed inside them. Unlike the women of the brothels, these artists were prized for their command of subtlety. They recited poems with a gentle clarity, drew shimmering notes from the strings of their zithers, and brushed calligraphy so fluid it seemed to breathe. Their presence never flooded a room, instead it shaped one, each gesture measured and deliberate. Guests often sensed a hidden rhythm running through the tea-houses. Voices flowed like slow rivers, music rose in soft waves, and the small clink of porcelain marked each moment like a quiet pulse. Some came in search of conversation, others in search of silence, but nearly everyone left with the same lingering impression that here time slowed and turned tender, as though it too wished to sit a while and finish one more cup. In the floating world of Kaifeng, pleasure did not start with desire. It started with calm, and the tea-houses were its purest form. As the night grew deeper, the tea-houses breathed out their last trails of steam, and another sound began to gather, the distant roll of drums, the flutter of silk sleeves, the warm chorus of voices drifting from the district's many theatres. These were the soul of the pleasure quarters, places where imagination was not merely amused but wholly set loose. To enter a Kaifeng theatre was to hand yourself over to a dream painted in movement, colour, and song. The buildings alone were feats of patient craftsmanship. Some were simple wooden halls with open stages and benches worn smooth by years of use. Others rivaled temple architecture, with carved rafters, dragon-headed beams, and facades adorned with scenes from ancient myth. Lanterns hung above in tiered clusters, casting a golden light that softened every edge and turned the faces of the audience into floating shapes of anticipation. Behind the screens, painted with plum blossoms and galloping horses, the actors made ready. Their makeup was not decoration, but transformation. White powder smoothing the face into an otherworldly mask, bold crimson strokes defining feeling, ink-black lines that could shift an entire expression with the smallest movement of the eyes. Costumes glimmered in the lamplight, embroidered robes of turquoise, mustard yellow, snow lotus white, and imperial red, each stitched with the symbols of the role it carried. The performances themselves braided many disciplines into one: poetry, martial arts, dance, and music. A single sweep of the silk sleeve could speak of heartbreak. The spin of a sword could raise tension like a sudden gust of wind. Musicians sat to one side of the stage, plucking zithers, striking wooden clappers, or drawing long, trembling notes from bamboo flutes. Old stories came alive again, generals torn between duty and love, spirits haunting the world of the living, lovers divided by family honour, immortals descending from clouds painted across the backdrop. For those watching, the theatre offered the purest kind of escape. Merchants forgot their ledgers, scholars forgot their exams, weary travellers forgot the miles behind them. In the pleasure quarters, a well-told story could lift a person out of the weight of ordinary life and set them gently down in another world entirely. When the last note faded and the lanterns dimmed, The guests rose slowly, like people waking from a dream they had shared. And as they stepped back into the glowing streets, Kaifeng's floating world seemed more enchanted still, as if the performances had soaked into the night itself. At the very center of that floating world, beyond the tea houses and theatres, lived the figures who embodied the district's deepest allure, the courtesans. They were not merely entertainers, nor simply companions. They were artists in the fullest meaning of the word, trained from childhood in poetry, music, painting, etiquette, and the delicate, unspoken craft of emotional presence. To meet a celebrated courtesan was to encounter refinement shaped into human form. Their homes, known as huaiyuan, or flower pavilions, stood quietly behind carved wooden gates. Some were small and intimate, filled with soft cushions, shelves of inkstones, and vases of seasonal blossoms that servants renewed each day. Others were grand, with inner courtyards, koi ponds, and moon gates, through which lantern light drifted like floating petals. Whatever their size, every pavilion carried the same gentle fragrance of incense, cosmetics, and freshly brushed silk, an atmosphere of tranquil expectation. A courtesan's charm began long before she spoke. Her appearance was a composition in itself, hair coiled into elegant loops and combed smooth with perfumed oils. Silk robes dyed in shades that flattered her, pale lilac, lake blue, lotus white, threaded here and there with silver or gold. When she moved, the fabric whispered, soft as a breath. When she sat, her stillness held the calm of someone who understood how much power rests in staying quiet. But her true art was expression. She could recite a Tang poem so clearly that each syllable felt like a drop of falling dew. She could brush characters so fluid that the strokes seemed to ripple like water. She could play the pippa with fingers so deft that listeners swore they heard not wood and string, but wind moving through bamboo. Even her conversation kept a gentle cadence, attentive, thoughtful, never rushed. People sought her out, not for crude pleasure, but for relief from the world. Scholars discussed verses with her and left inspired. Officials worn thin by politics found comfort in her patience and wit. Young nobles, restless and unsure, were steadied by her quiet confidence. A single evening with a gifted courtesan could feel like slipping into a sanctuary where one's burdens dissolved and calm took their place. Yet beneath the elegance lay an unspoken truth. The life of a courtesan demanded discipline, artistry, and resilience. Her refinement was never effortless, it was built through devotion. And for those who entered her pavilion, the experience stayed unforgettable, a moment suspended between reality and beauty, held gently in graceful hands. Beyond the flower pavilions, deeper down the dimmer alleys of Kaifeng's floating world, stood the houses that wove art together with intimacy, the refined brothels, known for their elegance rather than their excess. These were not places of hurried indulgence, but carefully tended sanctuaries, where desire was softened by ritual, conversation, and cultivated charm. Even the entrances spoke of restraint, carved wooden doors, silk banners stirring in the breeze, lanterns whose warm glow promised companionship wrapped in grace. Inside, the air held a subtle blend of incense, powdered sandalwood, and the faint sweetness of plum blossoms set in porcelain vases. Rooms were dressed with folding screens painted with cranes or mountain scenes, their colours muted under candlelight. Low tables held calligraphy brushes, wine cups, and instruments waiting to be played. Everything was arranged to slow a visitor's breathing, to quiet a restless mind, and to ease him into a different rhythm of the night. Unlike the courtesans of the flower pavilions, prized above all for their artistry, the women of these houses specialized in weaving comfort and feeling. They greeted guests with soft voices and practiced gentleness, steering conversation with an intuitive read of every mood. A guest's troubles were never brushed aside. They were absorbed into the warm room and folded into the evening's quiet unfolding. Wine was poured sparingly, never to dull the senses but to loosen stiffness and open space for genuine presence. Honeyed plum wine, chrysanthemum-infused rice wine, or a delicate pear liquor served in small translucent cups. Servers moved without a sound, refilling only as a cup reached its last sip, as though reading minds rather than watching for signals. What surprised many newcomers was the emphasis on connection over the body. A night here might mean reciting poems, listening to gentle songs played on the pipa, or trading stories beneath lantern light that flickered softly across the walls. Intimacy, when it came, unfolded slowly, more like calligraphy than passion, each stroke deliberate, balanced, mindful. For weary officials, lonely scholars, and travellers far from home, these refined brothels offered something essential, a place where a man felt seen, not as a title, a rank, or a burdened mind, but simply as a person. The women, skilled in both empathy and subtlety, made a space where vulnerability was met with grace. By the time a guest stepped back into the glowing streets, the world felt lighter. Desire had not devoured him. It had soothed him, reshaped into gentle companionship by the floating world's quietest artists. Behind the laughter, the music, and the gentle bustle of Kaifeng's floating world lay spaces that very few visitors ever saw. The hidden gardens and moonlit retreats kept for the truly trusted, the discreet, or the exceptionally fortunate. These secluded courtyards were threaded through the pleasure quarters like a secret stitch, quiet sanctuaries where the night deepened and the world softened into something intimate and dreamlike. Reaching one usually meant passing down a narrow passage, its walls lined with bamboo that whispered at the faintest breeze. A carved gate, plain, graceful, and always half in shadow, opened onto a courtyard bathed in pale moonlight. Here the noise of the city fell away as if caught by unseen hands. The air cooled, and the scent of night-blooming jasmine and damp stone replaced the incense and wine. These gardens were designed with intention, not to impress through grandeur, but to soothe through harmony. Small koi ponds held the reflection of the moon, their surfaces broken now and then by a ripple as fish slid beneath the lotus leaves. Rock formations were set with the same care found in classical painting, each stone chosen not for its size but for the way it steadied the space. Pebbled paths curved gently, avoiding straight lines, as though to invite wandering rather than arrival. Pavilions stood at the edges, their lattice windows glowing faintly with candlelight. Inside, low couches waited with embroidered cushions, scrolls lay open across lacquered tables, and teapots let go steady curls of steam. These retreats were not built for revelry. They were built for quiet conversation, unhurried reflection, and the kind of companionship that asked for no performance. Courtesans often brought their closest patrons here, not for intimacy in the usual sense, but for something far rarer, sincerity. Away from the eyes and expectations of the district, masks tended to slip. Officials spoke of their doubts, scholars confessed the fears the exams never let them voice, and wanderers told the stories the road had forced them to keep. The women, practiced at reading the undercurrents of feeling, listened with patient attention. Sometimes a pipa was played so softly that the notes seemed to float rather than sound. Sometimes only silence filled the space, shared in comfort between two people watching the lantern light tremble on the pond. And sometimes, when the moon rode high and the jasmine hung strongest in the air, a guest felt as if he had stepped clean outside the world. These hidden gardens were the floating world's quiet heart, places where pleasure turned into peace, and where the night itself seemed to pause and listen. In Kaifeng's floating world, music and calligraphy were never mere pastimes. They were languages, refined expressions that laid bare the inner rhythm of the night. Though most visitors came looking for talk, ease, or entertainment, a great many found themselves quietly drawn in by these gentler arts instead. They were the emotional foundation of the district, the thing that turned a passing evening into a memory that clung like ink on silk. Music led the way, moving through the pleasure quarters like a light breeze. The pipa, pear-shaped and quick with its bright liquid notes, was the most familiar voice of those nights. Courtesans plucked its strings with fingertips toughened by years of practice, yet still soft in their touch, drawing out melodies that could turn from playful to sorrowful with a single shift of tempo. Beside it, the guqin gave up deeper, more contemplative sounds, slow, trembling vibrations that seemed to settle straight into the chest. Guests who shut their eyes often insisted they could hear mountains, rivers, and wide-open skies inside its unhurried patterns. Bamboo flutes laid down yet another layer, breathy and warm, their notes drifting over the district like birds crossing a darkening sky. Now and then small groups formed on the spur of the moment in tea-houses or pavilions, mixing their instruments the way a calligrapher mixes ink. What emerged was never a performance meant to impress. It was an atmosphere meant to wrap around you, every note set down with care, every silence given room to breathe. Calligraphy carried a quieter magic of its own. Courtesans kept their inkstones close at hand at all times, along with brushes of wolf, rabbit, or goat hair, each chosen for a particular kind of stroke. When a guest showed interest, a woman might kneel at a low table and grind the ink slowly, letting its scent rise before she guided the brush across clean paper. The act itself was a kind of meditation, its beauty resting not only in the finished characters but in the flowing motion of wrist and arm. Some wrote out classical verse, others painted loose, free characters meant to catch the mood of the evening. Guests often found themselves held not by the meaning of the words, but by the calm of the process, the way each stroke seemed to gather feeling and let it go with careful control. To watch music and calligraphy in Qiang's floating world was to grasp that artistry here was never decoration, but something essential. It made moments that asked for nothing but your presence. And in a world where so much of life pressed relentlessly forward, these arts asked their guests only to slow down, to breathe, to listen, to watch ink open across paper and see that beauty could be both fragile and lasting. The pleasure quarters of Qiang were shaped as much by the people who came to them as by those who performed inside them. Every night pulled in a mosaic of personalities: scholars, merchants, government officials, travellers, and dreamers. Each after something different, and yet all of them eased by the district's gentle spell. Here, rank blurred, titles lost their stiffness, and people met one another not by their station, but through mood, curiosity, and a shared taste for subtle beauty. Scholars were among the most frequent visitors. Many had spent the whole day buried in the demands of the imperial examinations, a system that required perfect memory, flawless reasoning, and endless discipline. By the time evening came, their minds ached with Confucian classics and bureaucratic worries. In the floating world, they found relief. Tea-houses turned into their temporary academies, where debate ran more freely, and courtesans well read in literature offered insights that startled even the most self-assured young intellectuals. Some scholars left with fresh verses to turn over, others left with hearts quietly moved by a courtesan's calm smile. Merchants, worn down by bargaining and long travel, came for something else, company that had nothing to do with profit. They savoured the warmth of a shared cup, stories traded beside lantern light, and the comfort of being met as men rather than as negotiators. Many carried exotic goods from far-off provinces, spices, fabrics, carved trinkets, and gave them to their favourite courtesans, not hoping to purchase affection but to honour and art. Officials arrived warily, wrapped in layers of duty and discretion. Yet even the stern-faced bureaucrats softened within the pleasure quarters. Some wanted a partner for sparring over ideas, others wanted silence. A few came only to watch, taking comfort in seeing life unfold without any need to control it. The courtesans knew how to handle such men, listening without judgment, offering sympathy without obligation. And then there were the wanderers, people the road had marked with stories, soldiers between postings, monks passing through the capital, entertainers from other cities, and young dreamers still unsure of their place. They came with no expectations, content to sit beneath the lanterns, sip warm tea, and feel part of some wider, gentler human fabric. What tied all of these groups together was a shared need for refuge. The pleasure quarters were not an escape from responsibility so much as a pause from its weight, a place where feeling, beauty, and conversation moved freely. Here, every visitor, whatever his origin, found a small corner of belonging in Qiang's glowing night. As the night in Qiang thinned toward the pale edge of dawn, the pleasure quarters began their quiet undoing. The lanterns that had burned like warm constellations flickered as their oil ran low. The music grew softer, the talk trailed off, and the floating world, so alive only hours before, began folding itself gently away, like silk robes stored with care after an evening of elegance. The streets held a rare stillness at this hour. The laughter and footsteps that had rung beneath the eaves gave way to the soft sweep of brooms and the rustle of early vendors setting up their stalls. The scent of jasmine and warmed wine faded into the cooler smell of dew on stone and the faint sweetness of steamed buns rising in nearby kitchens. One by one the tea-houses shut their carved doors, curtains falling like tired eyelids after a long night of stories, debate, and hushed secrets. Inside the flower pavilions, courtesans snuffed their candles and loosened their elaborate hairstyles, letting the long weight of the day slip free. Their instruments rested on low tables, strings cooling in the morning air. The women moved now with a softer, more private grace, not the polished performance of the night, but the quiet routine of people who lived between two worlds. Some sat by their windows watching the sky brighten. Others wrote a last line of calligraphy to settle their thoughts before sleep. For them, dawn marked not a beginning, but an ending. The hidden gardens fell entirely silent. Moonlit ponds that had mirrored whispered confessions now held the first hints of sunlight, and the koi drifted lazily, undisturbed by the missing voices. The pavilions stood empty, their paper windows glowing faintly, as if keeping the last traces of the night. Even there the mood shifted from enchantment to rest, from intimacy to stillness. Patrons left slowly, stepping out carrying the lingering softness the district worked so hard to create. Scholars drew their robes a little tighter, still turning over poems recited hours before. Officials walked with lighter faces, their burdens eased for a while. Merchants breathed in the cool morning air, savouring the rare sense of a night spent in gentle company rather than in negotiation. By the time the sun had fully risen, the floating world had all but disappeared. The pleasure quarters looked ordinary again. Just another stretch of the city. Yet everyone who had walked its lantern-lit paths carried something out with them. The feeling of having lived, if only briefly, in a place built from art, beauty, and human connection. And they knew that when night came back, Qiang's hidden world would wake once more, ready to offer another evening of soft light, refined company, and dreams painted in music and silk. When people picture Alexander the Great, they see the battles, the dust of Issus, the river charge at the Hydaspes, the phalanxes locked into gleaming formation. But none of those victories could have happened without something quieter, far less glamorous, and yet infinitely more impressive, the logistical machine behind him. His army did not simply cross continents because it was brave. It crossed because every step was calculated, because the supplies kept flowing, because the system held. From the day Alexander left Macedon in 334 BCE, he wasn't merely leading an army, he was running a moving city of nearly 40,000 men. On the march, that city stretched for kilometers. Soldiers, cavalry, engineers, siege specialists, medics, blacksmiths, cooks, scribes, and interpreters. Behind them came thousands of animals, mules, camels, and pack horses, each loaded with tools, food, spare weapons, and medical supplies. The army had no trucks, no engines, no radios, and still it coordinated its movement across some of the harshest ground on earth with a precision that modern militaries continue to study. Alexander inherited a brilliant system from his father, King Philip II, and then refined it without mercy. The army travelled light, extraordinarily light for its size. Soldiers carried only the essentials, weapons, armour, a cloak, a few days' worth of grain, and often a simple cooking pot. Tents were reserved mostly for officers, while ordinary men slept under open sky, which cut the baggage weight and raised the speed. The less they hauled, the faster they marched, and for Alexander speed was as deadly as any spear. But movement was only half the story. The real feat lay in keeping the army supplied. Alexander understood that fuel, food, water, fodder mattered as much as bronze and iron. His scouts rode days ahead, charting wells, rivers, and villages, and local cooperation was arranged before the army ever appeared. If a region couldn't support the troops, the route changed. If grain was needed, caravans were organized. If the land was barren, rations were trimmed and marches shortened so the men wouldn't wear out. This careful choreography made the army almost unnatural for its age. A force that could move fast, strike without warning, and survive where other armies would starve. The logistics stayed invisible to most, yet they were the heartbeat, the silent engine, the reason a young king could take one army across deserts, mountains, and empires without ever letting it buckle under its own weight. Feeding 40,000 men wasn't a challenge so much as a crisis lying in wait every single day, and Alexander's commanders grasped this better than anyone. A soldier could fight without sleep and march on bleeding feet, but without food and water the army fell apart. Discipline dissolved, and the campaign's momentum died. So before any battle, any victory, any moment of glory, there was grain, tons of it, hauled, bought, taxed, or foraged to keep the machine alive. Barley and wheat were the backbone of the diet, each soldier eating roughly a kilogram a day. Multiply that by tens of thousands. Add the cavalry horses, the pack animals, and the herds trailing behind, and the totals climbed quickly into something staggering. Alexander met this not with stockpiles, which only slowed him down, but with constant acquisition. His scouts and quartermasters rode ahead to secure agreements with towns and villages before the army arrived, negotiating grain, fodder, salt, dried meat, and sometimes livestock, all delivered straight to the army's line of march. When cooperation failed, the Macedonians foraged hard. This was no random looting, but an organized sweep units fanning out in a radius around the marching column, gathering grain, cutting fodder, and seizing supplies. Even so, Alexander preferred diplomacy to destruction. Burn a village today, and there's nothing to eat tomorrow. Win its loyalty, and the supply line only grows stronger. The cavalry demanded even more attention. A single warhorse ate as much as 10 men, and Alexander had thousands of them, so grassland shaped his routes as much as strategy did. In barren country, herds of sheep and cattle marched alongside the army as a living supply line. Fresh meat, milk and hides moving on 4 legs, grazing the land as they went and feeding the men as needed. Water was the ultimate ruler of movement. On the march, the army often set out at dawn and reached a river or well by noon, before the heat turned lethal. Scouts located water days ahead, marking safe routes through regions where a single mistake could mean thirst and death. Alexander treated supply not as an afterthought, but as an invisible battlefield. Win that battle, and his men stayed strong. Lose it, and everything collapsed. Every day on the march, the supply officers fought a war of their own. One measured not in casualties, but in sacks of grain, hoof prints, and the precious sound of water running where it was needed. Alexander's victories are usually remembered for their heroic clashes, phalanx against empire, cavalry against chaos. But the real battleground lay beneath the soldiers' feet. Terrain was both enemy and ally. Roads, mountains, rivers, deserts, and passes shaped the pace, the direction, and the survival of the campaign, far more than any general's intentions ever could. Alexander understood this by instinct. He treated the land the way a master sailor treats the wind, something to respect, to exploit, and never to underestimate. The Macedonian army moved along routes chosen with obsessive care. Scouts and engineers rode ahead, studying the ground, measuring distances, finding water, and judging whether a column miles long could even pass. A road too narrow or too muddy could snarl the whole army and leave it open to ambush. A river too swift could drown hundreds of men and animals. Again and again, Alexander sidestepped disaster simply by shifting a route a few miles, a small adjustment with enormous consequences. Crossing mountains was among the hardest tasks of all. The Balkan ranges, the Taurus mountains, and above all, the Hindu Kush pushed the army past the limits of what men could bear. Passes so narrow that soldiers were forced into single file. Cold that left blades brittle, snow that blinded the horses, whole units menaced by avalanche and falling stone. And still, Alexander approached each climb with an almost mathematical composure. He scheduled halts at sheltered ledges, arranged for fires to be laid ahead of time, shifted loads among the pack animals so none would stumble, and set aside grain reserves meant only for these lethal ascents. The deserts asked even more. The Syrian steppe, the margins of Mesopotamia, and later the Gedrosian desert offered a kind of war with no opponent at all, only heat, thirst, and the slow loss of one's bearings. Here his progress rested entirely on what he had learned beforehand. Local guides, captured scouts, traders and wandering nomads were questioned or paid for what they knew of wells, buried springs and shaded wadies. One wrong bearing could kill thousands. His gift was not merely in taking counsel, but in choosing whose counsel to trust. Even flat country demanded care. The army advanced in loose blocks, cavalry held near the supply trains to shield them. Engineers repaired roads as they went, levelling ground, laying planks across boggy stretches, and shoring up crumbling riverbanks. Where no bridge stood, they raised one. Where a river ran too broad, Alexander turned to ferries, rafts, or seized ships. Every passage became a building project carried out at the speed of an army on the move. This was never simply travel, it was strategy. By commanding the land, he commanded time. He appeared when his enemies still placed him weeks off. He struck before they thought a march was even possible. The terrain never held him back. It magnified him, and that, more than any blade, made the campaign impossible to stop. No ancient march lived on strength alone. Armies without knowledge stumbled blind into deserts, ambushes, empty granaries, and poisoned wells. Alexander grasped this more keenly than any general of his time. His empire was raised not only by the phalanx, but by eyes and ears, by scouts, informants, interpreters, envoys, and local guides who together formed the nervous system of his supply machine. Every march opened with reconnaissance. Days ahead of the main column, his prodromoi, the light cavalry scouts, swept out in broad arcs, at times covering 50 kilometers in a single day. They charted the ground, checked the water, counted livestock in the villages, and watched for any hostile force. Their word decided everything: the route, the pace, the timing, the supplies that would be needed. A false report could bury thousands. A sound one kept them alive. But scouts by themselves were never enough. Alexander leaned heavily on the goodwill of the locals. In Asia Minor he came to terms with Greek cities that threw open their gates. In Syria and Mesopotamia he struck bargains with caravan traders who knew every well and oasis by heart. In Bactria and Sogdiana he made guides of captured tribal chiefs rather than enemies, offering them rank, wealth, or pardon. He understood a plain truth that few of his era did. A guide forced at spear point tells you where you wish to go, while a guide who comes willingly tells you where you need to go. Language, too, was a form of intelligence. The army carried interpreters fluent in Persian, Aramaic, Egyptian, and dozens of regional tongues. They pressed villagers about food stores, asked shepherds about the mountain passes, and gathered the rumors merchants traded about enemy movements. Sometimes Alexander questioned people himself, his curiosity being the stuff of legend. A lone shepherd, a caravan driver, even a child who knew where a hidden spring lay, might decide whether the next day's march ended in triumph or ruin. Diplomacy served supply as much as it served strategy. Alexander often sent envoys ahead of the column to arrange provisions, secure safe passage, or frighten a local ruler into compliance. Cooperation brought food and water. Defiance brought scorched fields and hunger. So he made cooperation the profitable choice. Protection in exchange for loyalty, self-rule in exchange for obedience, honor in exchange for aid. Local elites frequently found partnership far preferable to annihilation. Intelligence let the army strike like a finely aimed weapon. Without it, the phalanx might still have fought with courage, but courage does not locate a river, refill a granary, or reveal a hidden road. His scouts and informants did not merely assist the campaign. They made it possible, turning the unknown into the predictable and the predictable into victory. Battles may have shaped Alexander's legend, but sieges tested his stamina. Taking a walled city was never a question of nerve. It was a question of logistics, engineering, supplies, manpower, timber, tools, food, and above all, time. Every siege drained the treasury of resources at an alarming rate, and yet he never shrank from assaulting a fortress, because he had learned the steady rhythm of siegecraft: build, supply, press, and outlast. When the army encircled a city, the first command was not to attack but to build. Engineers and carpenters came forward with axes, tools, and rope. They needed staggering quantities of timber for ladders, rams, catapults, torsion engines, siege towers, and protective screens. That wood came from forests miles distant, felled by labor gangs who marched with axes instead of spears. The trees were cut, shaped, loaded onto carts or pack animals, and dragged to the siege lines. Overnight, the army became a construction crew. His engineers ranked among the finest the ancient world produced. They studied the walls, found the weak points, calculated the angles for their artillery, and set the siege towers in place. Carpenters raised platforms and walkways. Miners burrowed beneath the ramparts, propping their tunnels with timber that could later be set alight to bring whole sections crashing down. Each structure demanded a constant flow of nails, rope, pulleys, hides, shields, and spare wood. Siege logistics was like running an enormous workshop under enemy fire. Food grew harder still, because a besieging army stopped moving. Consumption climbed while foraging fell away. So Alexander laid his supply lines before the siege began. Grain was stockpiled in temporary depots behind the lines, and convoys of pack animals rotated between the depots and the front. Where he could, he won the cooperation of nearby villages to keep the food coming. A siege might run for days or for months, and without arranged provision even the mightiest army would starve. Time was the most precious commodity of all. A siege that dragged on invited disease, desertion, dwindling stores, and the arrival of enemy relief. So Alexander applied unbroken pressure. Artillery hammered the walls by day and night. Sappers dug without pause. Marines mounted amphibious assaults where a city sat beside water. The aim was not only to breach the walls, but to break the will inside them, to force surrender before the logistical clock ran out. Every stone flung from a catapult, every tower rolled forward, every timbered tunnel spoke the same truth. He did not win sieges by brute force. He won them by logistics, a blend of engineering, calculation, and tireless preparation that wore a city down long before the final breach. Water, for all that survival depended on it, was also among the deadliest obstacles the army met. Rivers behaved unpredictably. A flood could erase a camp. A current could carry off cavalry. A wide crossing could cut the army in two and leave one half open to ambush. And yet Alexander forded more great rivers than any commander of his day: the Granicus, the Tigris, the Euphrates, the Indus, and countless lesser streams. Each crossing was less a march than a logistical marvel of coordination, engineering, and timing. It began, as always, with reconnaissance. Scouts gauged depth, speed, the firmness of the banks, and possible fording points. Engineers then chose the safest method. In shallow water, soldiers waded across in tight ranks, shields linked to break the current, horses swimming beside them with reins held high. But deeper rivers called for invention. Alexander used ferry boats and improvised rafts wherever he could. Local craft were seized or hired, horses were carried over on barges or made to swim, handlers paddling at their side. The army lashed reeds, logs, and inflated animal skins into buoyant platforms strong enough to bear siege gear, carts, and grain. Artillery was taken apart, floated across, and rebuilt on the far bank. His favourite stratagem was psychological, crossing by night or upstream, leaving the enemy to guess the point of passage. At the Tigris the army went over in darkness, shields strapped to their backs as floats. At the Hydaspes he marched his troops up and down the bank again and again to baffle King Porus, then used a hidden island upstream to launch a surprise crossing in driving rain. Maritime logistics widened enormously once Alexander held the Phoenician ports. Sidonian and Tyrian shipwrights built and repaired his vessels. Fleets moved grain, siege equipment, and reinforcements along the Mediterranean shore, making coastal marches far less perilous. Later, in Mesopotamia and India, river fleets became floating supply depots. Boats shadowed the army, carrying tons of grain, medical stores, spare weapons, and even replacement horses. These fleets turned rivers from barriers into highways. Storms, though, remained a relentless foe. More than once he halted the march for days, waiting for the current to settle or for his engineers to build sturdier rafts. He knew that rushing a river could destroy an army faster than any enemy general. Every crossing added to his legend, but the true triumph lay in the logistics. He conquered rivers not through daring but through preparation, engineering, and a disciplined choreography that made stepping stones of dangerous water across a whole continent. Alexander's army marched on more than grain and discipline. It marched on bodies. The human engine that drove his conquests was forever threatened by exhaustion, wounds, sickness, and fear. Keeping tens of thousands of men healthy, willing, and steady through years of ceaseless campaigning called for a strategy as refined as the one that fed them. His brilliance lay not in tactics alone, but in his grasp that an army's spirit could break long before its supply lines did. Medical logistics started with trained hands. The army carried physicians, herbalists, and surgeons who travelled with the baggage animals. Their instruments, bronze scalpels, cautery irons, bandages, herbal mixtures, and splints, were carefully packed and replenished whenever it was possible. On the march they tended blisters, infections, and fevers. In battle they set up mobile stations where the wounded, borne by comrades or slaves, could be treated. Alexander set the tone himself. Caring for the injured was honourable, never shameful, and a wounded man was never left behind. That alone spared countless lives. Clean water mattered as much as any surgeon's skill. A tainted well could destroy an entire company. Scouts tested the water before the soldiers drank, and if it seemed doubtful it was boiled, strained through cloth, or cut with wine to kill what lurked in it, a surprisingly effective remedy for the age. In the deserts, dehydration became the true enemy. Famously, Alexander poured out a helmet of water offered to him in full view of his men, refusing to drink what they could not share. Gestures like that stirred morale more than any speech. Morale, in fact, was itself a resource to be managed. He understood that men who believed in the cause marched farther, fought harder, and bore hardship with fewer complaints. So he cultivated loyalty on purpose, eating alongside common soldiers, fighting at the front, honouring the dead by name, and sharing out plunder freely. After a victory he held games, feasts, and rites to remind the army that its suffering had meaning. Rotation was another quiet instrument. He let units rest, mend their gear, and recover while others took the lead. In winter, he often suspended large operations altogether, sheltering the army in cities or fertile country where food and warmth were plentiful. Such pauses staved off the burnout that many ancient commanders never thought to guard against. Exhaustion was always near. Heat stroke, frostbite, dysentery, and infection killed more soldiers than swords ever did. But Alexander kept his losses down by treating his men as the campaign's true assets. Logistics was never only about moving supplies. It was about preserving the human heart of the army, a force that followed him not from fear but from belief. An empire in motion could not function without communication. 40,000 men strung across miles of marching columns, supply trains, scouting parties, and engineering crews needed an unbroken flow of orders that were clear, fast, and dependable. In an age with no radio, no dispatches carried by vehicle, and no long-distance signalling beyond flags and fire beacons, the challenge was vast. Yet Alexander managed it with a system so effective that the army moved as one living thing. At its core stood the messengers, mounted couriers trained to cross rough ground at speed. They carried orders, spoken or written, from Alexander to his commanders, from commanders to their officers, and from officers down to the men. Their horses were the swiftest in the army, and fresh mounts waited at intervals along the main routes whenever he expected heavy activity. A courier could cover dozens of kilometers in a day, letting Alexander redirect whole units in hours rather than days. Within the marching column, order depended on discipline and structure. The army moved in organized blocks: heavy infantry, cavalry, light troops, siege engineers, and baggage trains, each aware of its place and its duties. Officers governed pace and spacing with horn blasts, drums, and shouted commands. A single shift in formation might require hundreds of men to move at once, yet because the training was so rigorous, the maneuvers unfolded smoothly even on narrow roads or broken ground. Before any major movement or battle, Alexander gathered his generals in council. These were no ceremonies but working briefings. He laid out the objectives, explained the terrain, and assigned each man his role, while his commanders could ask questions, voice concerns, and offer alternatives. By the time the council broke up, every senior officer understood the plan down to its details. This mattered enormously for an army that so often marched or fought far beyond its commander's direct view. And the flow of communication reached well past the ranks of soldiers themselves. Alexander maintained a web of informants, envoys, and cooperative local rulers who passed along word of the enemy's movements. Messengers travelled between conquered cities, smoothing each transition and keeping regional governments steady and dependable. Even in the middle of a lightning advance, Alexander left working administrative structures behind him, capable of holding supplies, order, and loyalty in place. This coordination was never purely a matter of battle. It was a matter of logistics. When the army had to change direction without warning, communication made sure the scouts set out first, the supply trains were rerouted, the engineers reworked their assignments, and the pack animals fell into a new arrangement. Strip that synchronization away, and the whole force would have dissolved into confusion. The truly remarkable thing about Alexander's logistical gift was not simply that he fed his army, but that he kept every one of its pieces traveling as a single body. Commands ran through it the way blood runs through arteries, never halting, never slackening, so that his war machine advanced with unity, exactness, and clear intent. For close to 10 years, Alexander's logistical system endured strains that would have torn any ordinary army apart. It fed men across blistering deserts, hauled siege engines over mountain ranges, kept war horses supplied across empty plains, and held thousands of shifting elements in perfect step. But even the finest machinery has a breaking point, and in the last years of the campaign, Alexander began to reach his. The earliest cracks showed in India. The monsoon turned roads into rivers. Grain spoiled before anyone could cook it. Baggage animals sank into mud so deep that whole carts simply vanished. Scouts strained to find any reliable landmark in a country reshaped by storms. Even veteran officers confessed they had never faced ground so hostile to movement. Every mile forward felt like a bargain struck with nature itself. Then came the strain on the men's spirits. The army had been marching for years, far longer than any soldier had ever expected. Homesickness turned into its own logistical danger. Rumors travelled through the camp that the edge of the world lay just ahead, that monsters dwelt in the eastern forests, that no road home remained. When Alexander ordered them to push still deeper into India, his men refused. It was not cowardice. It was that logistics, both physical and mental, had finally worn through. Food was unreliable, the weather was merciless, and morale hung by a thread. The march back through the Gedrosian desert delivered the final blow. Alexander tried to lead his army along a coastal path so bleak and remote that even the local tribes stayed away from it. Water scarcely existed. The wells were few and usually dry. The heat killed faster than any enemy weapon. Baggage animals dropped where they stood. Rations shrank to a few handfuls. Men stumbled onward half out of their minds, leaving behind comrades who could no longer walk. No brilliance of tactics can outrun thirst. This was not a collapse of planning. It was the plain and brutal fact that some landscapes simply cannot sustain tens of thousands of people moving as one. Logistics, the very foundation of Alexander's conquests, had at last found a battlefield it could not win. And yet even in that misery, the system held together just long enough to spare the army from total ruin. Scouts kept hunting for water. The remaining supply ships trailed the coastline, unloading what little they carried. Officers held the line of discipline. Alexander endured the same hardship as his men and refused any special comfort, and that alone kept the force from falling apart. By the time the battered survivors reached safety, the lesson stood plain. Alexander had driven logistics to its outer limit and past it. His campaigns were more than a triumph of strategy. They were proof of how far planning, discipline, and stubborn will could carry a civilization into the unknown. And in the end, it was logistics, not swords, that drew the final border of his empire. The Subura did not greet you kindly. It struck you in the nose, the ears, the chest, all at once, a surge of noise, smoke, heat, and packed humanity so thick it felt like stepping into another world entirely. Only a handful of steps separated it from Rome's respectable quarters, yet the contrast was so severe it might as well have been a separate city. Behind you stood marble temples and orderly streets. Ahead sprawled a tangled maze of taverns, brothels, workshops, and towering insulae, the cheap tenement blocks that leaned out over the road like crooked giants. The first thing anyone noticed was the sound. The Subura never slept. Even at daybreak, the streets pulsed with shouted quarrels, rattling carts, children chasing one another down alleys, and prostitutes calling from balconies. Vendors bawled prices for bread, olives, lamp oil, and boiled sausages. Smiths hammered iron in doorways. Beggars sang or wept for coins. And above it all, laundry lines stretched between windows like makeshift banners swaying in the warm Roman air. Smells piled on top of one another, wood smoke, fish stew, spilled wine, the sweat of hundreds of labourers, wet clay from the potters' shops, and the unmistakable reek climbing from gutters that served double duty as sewers. It was not pleasant, but it was alive. The Subura was the beating heart of Rome's working class, a district where life ran loud, fast, and forever on the verge of breaking into chaos. The buildings climbed high, often 5 or 6 stories, thrown up cheaply by landlords who worried far more about rent than safety. Fires were common. Collapses were more common still. Families crowded into tiny rooms lit by a single oil lamp. Freedmen, immigrants, craftsmen, gladiators, prostitutes, and criminals all lived wall to wall, stacked above shops and taverns that never closed their doors. You could buy anything in the Subura: food, sex, stolen goods, gossip, forged documents, protection, or trouble you had never gone looking for. And then there were the streets themselves, narrow, winding, half swallowed by shadow. They felt as if they were watching you. Stray dogs darted between legs. Thieves moved like ghosts. Drunks slept in doorways, while debt collectors prowled the alleys like hunting cats. Every corner carried a rumour or hid a secret. To the elite, the Subura was Rome's shame. To the poor, it was home. To visitors, it was overwhelming. But to Rome itself, it was essential. The place where the empire's labourers lived, where its gossip was born, and where its pulse beat loudest. To step into the Subura was to step into Rome's raw truth. If the Subura had temples, they were not raised from marble. They were built of cheap timber, cracked clay, and beams blackened by smoke. These temples were the taverns, the true meeting places of the district. Drinking houses stood on every corner, wedged between workshops and brothels, glowing with lamplight day and night. They were always packed, always loud, always trouble in waiting. Inside, the air was thick enough to taste. Oil lamp smoke tangled with steam off boiling pots of stew, and the sourness of old wine soaked into the wooden walls. Patrons pressed shoulder to shoulder on the benches, shouting over one another, slamming down clay cups, laughing, arguing, flirting, or scheming. A Suburan tavern was never merely a place to drink. It was a marketplace of stories, rumours, insults, and opportunities. Cheap wine flowed without pause, watered down but poured into endless clay cups. Stronger drink, brought unofficially from the provinces, was available if you knew whom to pay. Bread dipped in garlic oil, bowls of lentils, sausages spitting on iron pans, and fried fish from the Tiber were the ordinary fare. The food was not meant to impress. It was meant to keep a labourer on his feet for one more day of hard work. The tavern keepers knew their customers well. Posts were driven into the bar so a drunk troublemaker could be chained to them. Bodyguards lounged near the entrance, ready to hurl out thieves posing as patrons. Prostitutes drifted from table to table, offering a smile, a bit of talk, or far more if the price suited. Gamblers threw knucklebones in the corners, drawing small crowds as tempers flared over every roll. Above all, the tavern was Rome's gossip furnace. News moved faster here than in the Senate. If a politician had made a fool of himself, the Subura knew. If a gladiator had refused to fight, the Subura whispered it. If a rich merchant's daughter had run off, the Subura had the details within hours. Drink loosened tongues, and the tavern keepers forgot nothing. Fights broke out often, sometimes over insults, sometimes over a pickpocket caught in the act, sometimes simply because someone had swallowed one cup too many. But violence was almost routine here. The crowd parted, the fists flew, and then, as quickly as it had begun, it ended. Someone bought a round to make peace, and life carried on. In the Subura, the taverns were not a distraction. They were the district's soundtrack, noisy, smoky, crowded rooms where Rome's working class laughed, bled, plotted, and endured. When the sun sank behind Rome's hills, the Subura did not settle. It grew sharper. The night carried a different energy, thicker and more dangerous than the daytime disorder. Oil lamps sputtered to life, throwing long shadows across the crooked streets. From behind painted doorways and beaded curtains came the soft murmurs and bright laughter of Rome's most notorious trade, the brothels of the Subura. These houses came in every form. Some were little more than a single room behind a tavern, where a mattress on the floor and a curtain for privacy passed as comfort. Others were larger, multi-room establishments run by seasoned madams, the Linnae, who knew how to manage clients, bribe the guards, keep the peace between rival pimps, and pry money out of customers who swore they were broke. The richest brothels boasted mosaics on the walls, perfume in clay jars, and women or men dressed in fine linen. But even these luxury houses stayed firmly Suburan, loud, smoky, passionate, and always a little dangerous. The sex workers of the Subura were a mixed lot. Some were slaves working off debts or obeying the orders of their owners. Others were freedwomen or freedmen who had chosen the trade because it paid better than weaving, hauling, or hawking goods in the street. A few were runaways, fugitives, or people whose families had cast them off to survive however they could. They came from Greece, Syria, Egypt, Gaul, and every corner of the empire. The Subura was a melting pot of tongues, accents, appetites, and desperation. Their windows carried little painted signs, sandals for women, phalluses for men, masks for those who put on variety shows, and lamp symbols marking which rooms were free. Patrons lined the corridors, coins in hand, haggling loudly. Within, the mood was unpredictable, sometimes playful, sometimes mournful, sometimes brutal. The madams enforced their rules to keep fights from breaking out, but in a district like the Subura, trouble never stayed quiet for long. And yet the brothels were not only houses of lust, they were also clearinghouses of information. Soldiers boasted of upcoming deployments. Merchants murmured about shady bargains. The henchmen of politicians came seeking discretion and sometimes traded in bribes or secrets. A single evening could turn up a rumour worth a fortune. The prostitutes listened and remembered, and that knowledge made them valuable, protected, and now and then feared. To walk past the brothels was to pass throbbing music, muffled arguments, sudden bursts of laughter, and shadows that moved faster than the lamplight. The Subura's night economy was not hidden away. It was the district's lifeblood, pulsing openly through the streets. Here, vice was not a source of shame. It was business. It was survival. It was the Subura. If daylight revealed the Subura's noise and poverty, the night revealed its teeth. Crime here was no lurking force. It walked out in the open, breathed the same smoke-filled air, and slipped through every alley with practiced ease. The Subura was infamous across Rome for its thieves, gangs, and shadow networks, so deeply entrenched that even the city guard came in reluctantly and only in numbers. The thieves came first. Pickpockets slid through crowds like fish threading through reeds. Children often mastered the craft before they learned their letters. They tugged at belts, dipped hands into coin purses, or slit bags open with tiny knives. The cleverest did not steal boldly at all. They staged distractions, a rehearsed argument, a sudden fall, a spilled basket of fruit, and while every eye turned, a purse disappeared. Losing money in the Subura was not a rare stroke of bad luck. It was expected. Then there were the burglars. By night they crossed the rooftops, easing through open windows or cutting through flimsy shutters. The insulae made perfect targets, dozens of residents crammed into fragile apartments with almost no way to secure what little they owned. Burglars did not always work alone. Many belonged to one of the Subura's gangs, loose collectives held together not by loyalty but by profit. The gangs varied in size and reputation. Some controlled gambling dens or ran protection rackets over the brothels. Others specialized in extortion, demanding payment from tavern keepers to prevent unfortunate accidents. A few behaved almost like unofficial neighborhood guards, aiding residents in exchange for coin or shelter. But many were volatile, given to infighting, betrayal, and sudden violence. Their turf wars, fought with fists, clubs, or short daggers, tended to erupt without warning and send bystanders scattering. Rome's official security force, the urban cohorts, avoided patrolling the Subura after dark. They understood that the ground favored the locals, the narrow passages, the dead-end alleys, the rooftop shortcuts. Criminals moved through them as if by instinct, while an officer risked ambush, mockery, or worse. When the cohorts did enter, it was usually to recover a corpse, break up a riot, or escort a politician's private guard. Information was currency. Criminals traded it the way merchants traded spices. Who was carrying money? Who owed debts? Who was new to the district and likely unready for it? The Subura was a place where secrets never stayed buried for long, and where those who kept their mouths shut tended to survive the longest. And yet, for all its danger, its residents adapted. They moved at a brisk pace, tucked their purses out of sight, steered clear of particular alleys, and taught themselves to read which faces spelled danger. The Subura asked nothing of a person's morals. What it demanded was attention. In a quarter where thieves lodged wall to wall with honest workers, staying alive came down to a single blunt fact. The shadows owned these streets, and the streets never once fell still. Underneath all that noise, crime, and after-dark commotion, the Subura carried a second identity. It was the boiler room of Rome. The district was not populated solely by cutpurses and drunks. It sheltered tens of thousands of honest labourers and skilled craftsmen whose sweat kept the empire in motion. Whenever Rome was fed, built, manufactured, carried, cleaned, or mended, the chances were good that a Suburan pair of hands had touched the work. At first light, well before the taverns had cleared out, the workers spilled into view. Men shouldering baskets, coils of rope, bricks, clay pots, and tools drained out of the tenements like a slow river of tiredness. Porters made for the markets and warehouses to shift sacks of grain, amphorae of wine, or crates of fish. Builders tramped off to their sites gripping chisels and mallets, ready to cut stone or turn mortar beneath a punishing sun. Carpenters, metal workers, leather tanners, and cobblers unlocked their workshops, cramped little rooms lit by one lamp, where the air carried sweat, smouldering charcoal, and raw material. The women laboured no less. Many passed their days scrubbing clothes in the public basins, grinding grain, spinning wool, or hawking vegetables at the corners. Some cooked plain food to sell: bowls of porridge, bread with cheese, figs, boiled chickpeas, salted fish. Children pitched in, lugging water, feeding fires, or calling out prices to reel in a customer. In the Subura, work started early and dragged on late because getting by left no room for rest. Craftsmen formed the spine of the district. The ring of blacksmiths beating iron tools carried down the alleys. Potters worked clay right at their thresholds, throwing cups and storage jars destined to sell across the whole city. Shoemakers stitched sandals for soldiers, slaves, and merchants without distinction. Every trade had a place here, from barbers scraping stubble in the open street to scribes drawing up legal contracts for the few who could pay for their letters. For all the disorder around them, the labourers propped one another up. Neighbours passed food along when someone fell sick. Women kept an eye on each other's children. A water carrier would hand a spent worker a drink for 1 coin. This was not charity. It was arithmetic. Life in the Subura was simply too punishing to shoulder alone. Money never went far. Most residents lived from one wage to the next, forever wrestling with hunger, rent, sickness, and the crush of too many bodies. Yet whatever comfort the Subura withheld, it repaid in toughness. Every face carried a story of endurance. Every workshop testified to a skill. Every sunrise uncovered a district that, for all its vice and violence, kept Rome fed, clothed, and moving. The Subura was never lovely, but it functioned, and Rome functioned because of it. If the streets of the Subura were bedlam, the buildings rearing over them were worse. The insulae, Rome's notorious tenement blocks, loomed above the district like crooked giants, story piled on story, climbing 5, 6, sometimes 7 floors. They tilted at strange angles, groaned in the wind, and shifted under the weight of hundreds of tenants. These were not dwellings raised with care. They were investments raised in haste. Landlords wanted rent, not durability, and the outcome was some of the deadliest housing in the ancient world. The moment you passed through the door of an insula, you felt life squeezed into far too little room. The ground floor tended to hold workshops or taverns, so the air was thick with smoke, steam, and unbroken racket. Above that, narrow stairways corkscrewed upward, steep, mismatched, and murky even at midday. Most residents kept a small oil lamp to feel their way, since one slip on those steps could snap a leg or worse. The rooms were tiny, often a single cramped chamber for a whole family. Furnishings amounted to little: a straw mattress, a wooden stool, a handful of clay bowls, perhaps a curtain for privacy if fortune smiled. Kitchens were scarce. People cooked over small braziers that packed the rooms with smoke and made fire a standing threat. One stray spark could race up an entire building in minutes and turn an insula into a lethal furnace. Water posed its own ordeal. Only the better insulae drew on aqueduct-fed fountains in their courtyards. The rest hauled buckets up and down several flights each day, threading crowded stairwells while guarding against a single spilled drop. Night delivered another trial: darkness. Lamps came dear, and the oil dearer still. Many families sat in near total black after sundown, hoarding the little they had. Sound travelled through the walls as if the walls weren't there. Quarrels, wailing infants, drunken songs rising from the taverns below, footsteps of people forever coming and going. The Subura's insulae never knew silence, and privacy was a luxury few could picture. Even so, these vertical slums thrummed with community. Neighbours traded food, minded children, swapped rumours, and guarded one another against thieves. They lived heaped in layers, a cross-section of Rome's struggling class: freedmen, immigrants, day labourers, widows, runaway slaves, and the drifting poor. Dangerous, overcrowded, unsound, the insulae were the grim truth behind Rome's gleaming marble. In the Subura, life did not merely unfold in the streets, it unfolded above them, in rickety towers, where survival meant adjusting to a world built upward rather than out. If the Subura had a pulse, it hammered hardest in its street markets. From sunrise until long after dusk, the district became one living marketplace, chaotic, loud, impossible to resist. Every alley, courtyard, and bare patch of dirt turned into a trading floor where coins passed hands as fast as insults flew. The Subura owned none of the forum's polished, columned markets of marble. It had mud, sweat, haggling, and the daily work of staying alive. Vendors turned up before dawn, dragging carts or balancing baskets slung from yokes across their shoulders. They claimed their pitches with practiced belligerence, bickering over inches of ground. By the time sunlight reached the rooftops, the district's smell had already shifted: roasted nuts, simmering lentils, salted fish, grilling sausages, and onions spitting in oil. Hungry labourers pressed around the food stalls, eating on their feet before heading off to work. Food was cheap, plain, and filling. Bakers sold flatbread still warm from the clay ovens. Fishmongers laid out the morning's catch on water-soaked planks, drawing cats and hungry children in equal measure. Greengrocers bawled prices for olives, leeks, chickpeas, and figs. Women ladled porridge into clay bowls for a coin. A fortunate few offered small luxuries: honey cakes, dates from Syria, spiced wine, though these were rare treats saved for special days. Beyond food, the streets were jammed with sellers offering nearly anything a Roman might want. Leatherworkers spread out sandals and belts. Tinkers displayed bronze pans, pots, and repair tools. Barbers set their stools right on the paving and shaved customers while gossip circled them. Fortune-tellers read palms beside herbalists peddling cures for headaches, fevers, or broken hearts. Performers, jugglers, flute players, snake handlers gathered crowds thick enough to choke off whole walkways. The din never let up. Vendors shouted in Latin, Greek, Syriac, and Egyptian dialects. Buyers argued hard to shave a coin off the price. Children darted between legs. Dogs barked. Chickens broke loose from their cages. And somewhere in the frenzy, a thief was always making his move, since markets were prime hunting ground for nimble fingers. But the Subura's markets were more than trade. They were the district's forum for gossip. Women passed news as they bought vegetables. Men argued gladiator results over cups of spiced wine. Soldiers on their way through flirted with the stall-keepers. Talk moved as freely as smoke off the cooking fires. If anything happened in Rome, a scandal, a death, a political storm, the Subura markets heard it first, and they carried it faster than any herald. In these packed lanes, survival was a craft. Selling, buying, bargaining, all of it took instinct and grit. The market was not only where Suburans fed their families, it was where they lived their lives, minute by noisy, smoky, unforgettable minute. No district in Rome lived nearer to catastrophe than the Subura. Here, danger needed no invader and no uprising. It could flare from a kitchen fire, a drunken argument, or a small misunderstanding in a crowded alley. And when disaster came here, it came hard. Across the empire, the Subura was famous for three things: fires, riots, and a deep mutual distrust between its people and the officials meant to hold them in check. Fire was the oldest foe. Insulae thrown up from cheap timber and dry plaster became tinder boxes in the hot months. One toppled oil lamp or cooking brazier could set a whole building alight. Flames scaled the wooden stairways like ladders, leaping from apartment to apartment in minutes. Smoke choked the narrow streets long before the residents grasped that they were trapped. Neighbours burst into one another's rooms, snatching up children and dragging elderly tenants down failing staircases. Fire played no favourites. It swallowed everything. The Subura had no organised fire brigade. Buckets, wet cloths, and frantic shouting were the only defence. Now and then the urban cohorts turned up with axes to pull down burning walls, but more often the blaze had already claimed half the block. People rebuilt again and again, because they had nowhere else to go. Riots came just as readily. Cramped living, poverty, hunger, crime, and relentless strain kept the Subura at a simmer. If a landlord raised the rent, a fight erupted. If a crooked official demanded bribes, crowds massed with stones in hand. If two gangs quarrelled over turf, the whole street turned into a battlefield. Wine-fueled tavern brawls poured out into the alleys. During festival seasons, the excitement curdled into chaos, and torches, drums, and drunken shouting often shoved a crowd past the point of control. The city's authorities were afraid of the Subura. Urban cohorts patrolled it seldom and only ever in numbers. Politicians told their guards to keep clear of certain streets entirely. Walking into the Subura unprotected was reckoned foolish, even for a seasoned soldier. The residents trusted the authorities no more in return. They saw them as outsiders, tax collectors, enforcers of rules blind to the grind of ordinary days. The Subura dealt out its own justice. Thieves were beaten by neighbours. Troublemakers were run off. Gangs brokered truces without ever calling in the law. And yet, when disaster struck, unity surfaced in an instant. When a wall came down, dozens dug for survivors. When a riot turned genuinely deadly, neighbors threw themselves around children and strangers alike. The Subura was volatile, unpredictable, and dangerous, and also fiercely protective of its own. Here, survival was no pastime. It was a communal reflex, forged in fire, fear, and endurance. For all its grime, danger, and ceaseless noise, the Subura held something the polished quarters of Rome lacked: a soul. It was not a district raised on marble pride or aristocratic ceremony. It was raised on human energy, raw, unfiltered, unstoppable. The Subura was where Rome's heart beat at street level, where the empire's poorest and boldest scratched out a life in the city's cracks. Culture flourished here, not in libraries or lecture halls, but in daily living. Storytelling happened in taverns over cheap wine, where old men rehearsed gladiator fights, romances gone sour, and rumours of imperial scandal murmured by drunken soldiers. Music floated down from the upper floors, flutes, drums, or makeshift instruments hammered out on clay pots. Children danced barefoot in the alleys, chasing each other through shadows lit by oil lamps. Languages ran together without pause. Latin mingled with Greek, Aramaic, Punic, Egyptian dialects, and the rough vowels of Gaul and Thrace. In one marketplace you might catch 10 corners of the empire arguing in a single dispute. The Subura was not diverse because Rome willed it so. It was diverse because Rome swallowed the world, and the world ran downhill into its cheapest district. Faith was every bit as lively. Street shrines stood beside doorways. Small statues of the Lares, the household gods, watched over families scraping to get by. Women burned incense and cracked open clay bowls. Men left coins or scraps of bread at improvised altars. Foreign cults held ground too: Syrian, Egyptian, Jewish, Mithraic. The Subura welcomed any god willing to welcome its people. Religion here was no ritual. It was survival. For all its reputation, the Subura also bred talent. Actors, boxers, gladiators, fortune-tellers, healers, midwives, craftsmen, cooks, musicians. Many of Rome's most vivid characters emerged from these tangled lanes. Some climbed to fame, some climbed to infamy. Most simply lived unremarked yet essential, driving the empire's vast machinery from below. Identity in the Subura had nothing to do with bloodline or wealth. It came down to toughness, street sense, and community, knowing which corners not to walk after dark, knowing whom to greet and whom to avoid, knowing how to stretch a coin to the next payday. Families that endured for generations here grew a fierce pride. Being Suburan turned into something larger than an address. It became a temperament. Rome's elite waved the Subura off as a sink of vice. But had the district disappeared, Rome would have caved in behind it. Its workers raised the city's monuments, stocked its markets, bore its loads, and traded the rumours that kept its politics alive. The Subura was chaotic, dangerous, and wearying, and altogether irreplaceable.